This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. The trouble started when he went for a walk. Or perhaps it had started with the cup of coffee he drank just before going out. It wasn't so much the coffee as the milk, but that hadn't seemed important at the time. It was cold outside. The residue of a snowstorm lingered along the sides of the road. The potholes were filled with icy water. There was no one about. Even the birds had gone. As he turned up Whitehead Road, he thought that were it not for the occasional low rumble of distant traffic, he could be walking in any era. This was the potentiality of time travel, that sense of otherness in a familiar place. The desire to build a machine to do the job was just a vestige of industrial capitalism. There was no need for strange alloys and glowing control panels. The answer would lie somewhere else. It most likely involved individual perception, which implied time travel could only be conducted alone. He was alone now. He was coming to his favourite stretch of the road, where it bent like an S, past the decayed tennis court. There was a gentle upward slope that curved slightly to the right and blocked his vision, just long enough to delay the onset of pleasure for half a second. This part of the road had a pungent lack of time. It was appealing all year long, from the blossoms of the mountain laurel to the dead tannic-smelling leaves, and finally the ice. The seasonal metamorphosis reminded him how different the same things could be. The obvious had as much mystery as its counterpart. There was an old culvert that he liked to stop and look at whenever he walked that way. It was a rectangular trough encased in bluestone that vanished beneath the driveway. But as he approached it, he saw he was not alone. Someone else was already there. A man stood looking at the stones. He was striking on account of his eccentric clothing, jodhpurs disappearing into knee-high boots, and a military-style coat of green tweed, open despite the cold. A hipster Cossack, recently up from the city, no doubt. He passed him by. Timelessness contracted into the present with a jolt. His mood was tarnished. This trespasser had denied him the mystery of his surroundings. It wasn't so much the people who'd been moving up from the city in droves that annoyed him, but their attitudes of entitlement. They had the arrogance of immortals. He tried to brush these angry inner conversations aside. He was a hypocrite because he too had once been a young hipster from the city. It was better to acknowledge your prejudice than to pretend you had none. He regained his composure as he continued around the S-bend, alone again. The wizened tangle of wild vines made scribbles against the cold sky. This section was short, too short. It was always a disappointment. He would have liked to walk on it for at least half an hour, but it only took several minutes. He was soon in the woods, heading towards White Pines, the house that Ralph Whitehead had built for himself in 1902. Then he saw the Cossack again, leaning on a boulder, smoking a cigarette. It came as a shock, and his heart rate quickened. Either the laws of physics had fluctuated, or there was something wrong with him. How could this man be ahead of him when he had just left him behind? He thought about the milk. Something so seemingly inconsequential might actually have signified this cognitive degeneration, or was perhaps even a symptom of it. He'd looked in the fridge and it wasn't there. Then he saw it on the counter. He must have forgotten to put it away. He turned to fill his coffee cup, but when he reached for the milk, it was gone. He found it again, back in the fridge. He could see the man's face, but not his eyes. They were covered by a pair of blue mirrored sunglasses. In each lens was a distorted, minuscule version of himself. The Cossack leant back, nonchalantly smoking his cigarette. It was impossible to know what those eyes were looking at, hidden behind the lenses, so he kept on going. He was suddenly overcome with the most profound doubt. The things he had taken for granted, like air and solid ground, no longer seemed so certain. There was a clear demarcation between the way he had seen his life before and the way it appeared to him now. Everything was different. The light, the trees, the rocks. He knew this difference must lie in his own perception, but it seemed to be expressed by the things he was looking at. Object and subject were intertwined. He'd become a self-conscious part of the landscape, or merely a figment of it. When he emerged from the trees at the Whitehead house, the man from the city was already there, peering into a window. It was strangely unsurprising now to see him again. 3 times was all it had taken for him to accept the impossible. "Excuse me, can you tell me how you've managed to stay ahead of me when I've passed you twice?" "If I could tell you that, I wouldn't be here." "Where would you be then?" "Somewhere else." He had a faint Irish accent. His face had a weather-beaten quality that suggested a tough life, even though he barely looked 40. Thick black hair brushed his shoulders. His eyes were still obscured. "So, it's not just me. You've noticed it too?" "I have. But the way I see it is that you're always behind me, no matter how many times you pass me by." "Well, we're in the same place now." They were standing at the front door of White Pines. It seemed a little too narrow for a building that size. It reminded him of an entrance to a tomb. There was a heaviness to this place, with its thick beams and dark siding. There was also the weight of history that had run its course, the effect of entropy on human endeavour, the aroma of absence. Once, this house had been the centre of a utopian community, humming with artists, potters and craftsmen. Ralph Whitehead had owned most of the mountain, paid for with the profits from his father's mills in England. It was money filtered down from the Industrial Revolution, with the catalytic spark of inspiration from William Morris, that had created this utopia. There had been parties and wealthy visitors. Furniture was built. Domestic servants were an acceptable necessity. He tried the door. It was locked. It always was. "What do you think's going on?" "I don't think there's anything going on, mister, that hasn't been going on a long time already. I've never experienced anything like this. I think there's something unusual happening." "That's because you're on a tree." "One of 3. The way he said 3 made it sound like tree, which was faintly amusing. He felt a hint of pleasure at being singled out this way, but it was ridiculous to be swayed by flattery. Why would he assume that a perfect stranger had any more wisdom than he did? "Who were the other 2 then?" "Well, one of them would be me, and the third would be the both of us together."
That was One of 3, written and read by Tom Newton. Well, there's a lot to unpack here. Walking in the woods, time travel, migrations from city to country, hipster fashions, prejudice and hypocrisy, objects that seem to move on their own, objectivity and subjectivity, failed utopias, Even the way the Irish pronounce the TH digraph, or in this case, the voiceless interdental fricative.
Yes, quite.
But before we get into all those subjects, have you noticed that we're tending to do much more straight interviews than we used to do when we started the podcast? Very few strange twists and weird gimmicks lately. Why do you suppose that is?
Yes, you're right. It does seem that way. But it might not actually be the case. Take this interview, for example. It sounds straightforward enough. But a listener can't know that at this moment, as I speak, I'm wearing a diving suit. You know, one of those antique ones you see in Tintin books.
True.
Except I'm not wearing the helmet. I've got a baguette strapped to my head and I'm holding a melon. There's no way a listener would know that if I hadn't mentioned it. What we're doing here is an experiment. Absurdism masquerading as seriousness. It's been remarkably effective, don't you think?
Yeah.
It sounds just like the real thing.
Yes, it does. Well, I was thinking this may have to do with the theme of your story, The Best of Luck, which was our very first episode over 5 years ago. Could it be that we're evolving more and more into candidates for the Idle House, where no one has to do any work?
It might, and I'd be fine with that. But are traditional interviews any less work than crazy ones?
Well, I think so.
In that story, the main point, or at least what lay behind the main point, or slightly to its side, was that the concept of work might rank among the gravest errors of humanity. And by work, I mean the kind where you sell your means of production for money.
Yes.
It's a corner we've allowed ourselves to be pushed into. Inequality and suffering are the results, along with environmental degradation. It's a disease that has been festering for about 15,000 years. The prognosis is not good.
Yeah.
Though, I just read an article about the recent discovery of graves from that era that suggests that those pre-agricultural people didn't have the kind of social equality we currently imagine they did. So, I may be completely wrong, and just adhering to a golden age mentality.
Well, an author interview can be just a conversation over a cup of coffee. Easy.
Yeah, and if you got rid of the words author and interview, it might even be a normal conversation. Probably better not to record it, though.
Well, because I'm so good at that state of mind that uptight people like to call lazy, I'll just ask you a simple question. How did this story come about?
It came from a walk I like to take around where I live. I've done it many times in all seasons. I can walk it in my mind. That walk became the situation of the story. As I mentioned, when I walk in the woods, I feel as if I could be in any era. That feeling gave rise to the speculation about time and whether it's a personal thing, slightly different for everybody perhaps. And I'm fond of psychogeographical questions. How much can a person or animal be considered part of the landscape? What is their correlation?
Yeah.
And there had to be some humour too, that divine unguent that soothes the wounds of self-importance. Incidentally, the idea that someone could pass someone else who's always ahead of them has been in my head for years. It's a kind of conceptual Mobius strip. I was told it by someone who swore that he'd really had that experience.
Well, the protagonist of your story mentions walking past a decayed tennis court. I like that subtle connection to your other story, The Tennis Court, in which a very strange match takes place. It's clearly the same tennis court. Many of your stories have such shared details, so you're doing quite a bit of subtle world building, creating an authorial universe that, rather than an alien planet, might be said to be the inside of your head. Readers actually get to know you. How intentional is that?
I suppose writing a story is an act of intention, though the result might not be. Depends on the opinions of those who read it. But deliberately creating a personal world with inner continuity so other people can get to know me, I wouldn't go that far. And yes, it is the same tennis court as in the other story you mentioned. I've gone there a lot and looked at it from every angle. The forest is reclaiming it. That makes me understand the transitory nature of humanity. What seems so solid and secure, so ineffable, is in a continuous state of disintegration.
Yeah.
In the silence, I hear the thwack of the ball in games gone by. That's what I mean by the weight of history. The Whitehead House is potent with it, a kind of gravitational force that acts upon the emotions of an observer. You know, I once looked through a window there and saw a pile of shoes spilling out of a closet. The people were long gone, but the moment seemed to reverberate. Quite spooky.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about Cossacks, a word that means free men. They were both an ethnic group and a military force.
But that's beside the point. I thought we were going to talk about all those subjects you listed.
We are, but we have all the time in the world to do that because time keeps turning back on itself, right?
Or overtaking itself, yes.
Or is it just a bunch of moments falling on us like raindrops? Or confetti? I stole that from a TV series.
What? You stole confetti? How long is a moment anyway? 3 seconds? Could it be something you're only aware of when it's past? Or is it that you can't think about a moment and experience it at the same time?
Well, time seems to be a topic we can't stay away from on this podcast. So let's stay away from it. Instead, let's talk about scatological humor.
There's nothing scatological in this story.
Well, not if that voiceless interdental fricative in the last sentence had been properly pronounced.
There you go again.
But instead, you do an Irish accent quite well.
Oh, thank you.
This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Snake by XJ5000. This is episode 21111.